I'm Clara, 30. For 6 years, my life ran on autopay. The mortgage that kept the house from becoming a sentence, the utilities that kept my parents' lights on, the grocery runs that made sure there was always bread when they wanted it. I did the math twice a month the way other people check the weather. Automatic, boring, necessary. 70% of the house ran on my paycheck, and a quiet conviction that love looks like showing up with checks, not speeches. Each morning, I woke to the same small domestic orchestra, the kettle clattering on the stove, the old wood floors complaining as my father, Martin, padded to the bathroom, the muffled TV news my mother, Evelyn, used like a blanket. I taped my receipts into a little shoebox in the closet under the stairs. Bank transfers, emailed confirmations, grocery app invoices, because the adult thing to do felt like gathering proof you existed. My name on a ledger made me real in a house that otherwise forgot me between the couch cushions and the calendar pinned to the fridge with faded magnets. I didn't make a fuss. I learned the vocabulary of quiet. "It's fine," I said when the heater went out in winter. "No, you don't need help with that," I said when my mother reached for a jar. I sat at the kitchen table and did my work by lamplight, balancing spreadsheets beside my tea, while my parents debated which neighbor's casserole had been the best. My free time was bracketed by errands and small kindnesses, a lawn watered because my father gets arthritic in his knees, a mechanic paid because my mother refuses to ask. That kind of devotion doesn't feel like power when you're the one giving it. It feels like oxygen. Invisible, and then indispensable. People told stories about sacrificial daughters with the kind of reverence reserved for saints and fools. I believed that if I kept paying, kept sacrificing, love would be honored in its own time, an old-fashioned payoff that arrived in gratitude or, failing that, in peace. The house, to me, was a slow-burning promise. I kept the bills from piling up, and in return, I kept my place in the story. My comfort was the kindness in a bank transfer. My religion was never asking for recognition. What's at stake isn't the mortgage number. It's the ledger that maps my life. Every direct deposit like a breadcrumb trail proving I belonged. It's the version of myself I'd been whispering into existence every time I paid for cable or replaced the faucet. If something pulled the thread on that invisible rope, if what I had always assumed was love was just unpaid labor labeled as charity, I'd lose more than a roof. I'd lose the quiet architecture of my identity, and I'd finally have to decide whether to keep proof of everything in a shoebox under the stairs or turn that shoebox into something that could no longer be ignored. The morning started small and ordinary. Coffee that tasted like machine-warm disappointment, a single candle in a store-bought cupcake that I'd half hoped would turn into something else. I carried the cupcake into the kitchen because habits die harder than people do. My mother, Evelyn, glanced up from her crossword and said without looking, "Is that for you?" My father, Martin, who'd been pretending to read the paper, folded it down like a petition and said, "You're 30, Clara. Maybe it's time you stood on your own." I laughed because laughter is a good reflex when the ground starts to tilt. "Okay," I said, thinking we'd joke or that anyone would put an arm around me and say the usual nonsense about how you can't kick a bird out of its own nest. Instead, Martin set the cup of coffee on the counter with a carefulness that made me think of a man returning a library book he'd never read. "You've been freeloading," he said. The words had been polished. They slid easily, like a slander someone had practiced in front of a mirror. Evelyn didn't contradict him. She folded her hands, a saintly gesture I'd been taught to accept as love. "You're what?" I asked. The kitchen light buzzing overhead sounded suddenly like a tribunal. "You don't contribute enough." Martin began, then stuck to the talking points, the script of a family that had convinced itself of its own righteousness. "We've carried you for too long." I remember feeling, in the same instant, all the small transactions I'd made for 6 years. The mortgage payment 2 weeks late because my payroll bounced and I stayed up until midnight transferring money. The December when I bought the turkey and hid the receipt in my sock drawer because my mother liked surprises. the countless dinners I'd brought home after staying late. I remember all of them as if they were beads on a string I hadn't realized I'd been wearing in full view. "Get your things," Evelyn said. The sentence had the economy of a bank notice. No pleading, no negotiation, just a directive. I tried logic first. I pulled a bank app up on my phone and scrolled because numbers are supposed to be neutral arbitrators. "I pay 70% of the bills," I said. Not that I wanted to argue, but because a person whose life is an accounting ledger believes accounting will save them. Martin watched the screen like it was a magic trick that would embarrass me into silence. "You're twisting things," he said. "You're trying to make us look bad." That was the word that landed. Their fear of looking bad outweighed any truth. They didn't want to be the ones living off their daughter. The story that suited them, one in which they were the wronged parents of an entitled child, was simpler and, in their minds, safer than a narrative that admitted dependence. I packed a bag because the practical muscle memory of leaving a home you own is different from the moral muscle memory of being expelled. Boxes accumulated like punctuation marks, a mug here, a framed photo there. Neighbors moved their heads at the sight of the boxes, the way gulls study an open trash bag. Mrs. D'Amico from the diner crossed the street with a look of discreet curiosity that said she'd heard 3 versions already and was deciding which to keep. People in small towns are efficient with stories. Once a narrative starts, it feeds itself. Word spread by noon. My cousin Chester, who'd always been a little too eager to pick sides at family barbecues, texted an ambiguous thumb emoji and then stopped answering. My old boss's wife said at the grocery that she'd always suspected I lived luxuriously. Someone I'd gone to high school with called me entitled in a message that read like a headline. That's when humiliation left the kitchen and moved into my clothes. The eviction itself was neither cinematic nor legal. No sheriff's badge, no dramatic wrenching of a lock. It was a morning of slammed cupboards and slammed words. "You have until tonight." I stood in the doorway while they boxed up a life I'd paid for with invisible labor. I should have been furious in the moment. Instead, I felt oddly small. The way a punch feels softer when you don't see it coming. As I closed the door behind me, the house looked the same as always. Peeling paint on the windowsill, the crooked welcome mat, a spider web on the corner of the porch. What had changed was the ledger in my head. Every transfer, every errand, every unpaid request filed away like evidence waiting for a judge I didn't yet know I'd become. I carried a single shoebox with receipts, the small shoebox I'd made into a kind of altar for proof, because I'd always believed proof was something you kept for tax season, not for survival. Neighbors watched from lawns as I stacked my boxes into the trunk of my old car. A kid from across the street, the kind you know will keep score of everything, stared like a referee cataloging fouls, and the whispers started, not gentle speculation, but an appraisal. "She was a burden," someone said. Finally, they did the right thing. The town, which once blurred into the background of my life, folded me into a narrative that made sense to other people. The lazy daughter punished, the parents who finally set boundaries. Humiliation morphs into a new kind of clarity if you let it. Standing on the curb with a garbage bag of my life, watching my parents close the front door like a curtain on a bad play, I felt my anger settle into something colder and cleaner. My silence had been the oil on which everyone else slid. It had greased the gears of their version of the truth. For 6 years, I'd been complicit in being invisible because I thought invisibility was love. As the sun went down on my 30th birthday, the town lights came on like pinholes in a curtain. I sat on my packed boxes and listened to the neighbor's lawnmower somewhere down the block, the mundane hum of a place that could be cruel without raising its voice. I realized then that the shoebox of receipts in my trunk was not an afterthought. It was a ledger that could rearrange people's stories. The fracture had broken the house, but it had also cracked the mirror everyone used to see themselves as innocent. Whatever came next wasn't just about getting a roof. It was about making sure the truth couldn't be mistaken for ingratitude again. I sat in the passenger seat of my car and made a list like a surgeon planning an incision. The shoebox became a binder. Plastic sleeves, labeled tabs, a table of contents. Because if you want people to believe you, you don't waive receipts. You present an argument. I spent 2 nights turning numbers into a narrative. Date, amount, purpose, a short note tying the payment to whatever it had paid for. December 2019, $1,200 mortgage. April 2021 $87 hot water heater part. July 2022, $320 groceries before their anniversary dinner. I annotated vacations and dinners with the transfers that had put them there. I printed copies. I scanned the bank alerts and the grocery app screenshots until the binder felt heavier than the fear that had been sitting in my ribs for months. I made one for myself, one for a lawyer consultation I hadn't yet booked, and then a lot more. Pamphlet-sized packets meant to move through the town with the slow efficiency of a rumor. I taped the little packets to the community bulletin board at the post office, slid one under the door of the church office, left a stack at D'Amico's diner with a note. Please read. For context. For truth. Take a copy. I sent an email, no flourish, no accusation, to every cousin, aunt, and neighbor who had a direct line to the town's social life. The subject line was simple: the math. I didn't call it revenge in my head. It felt more like making a ledger public so people could choose which story they wanted to keep. Still, there was a strategy, not one big theatrical blow, but dozens of small, undeniable ones landing where people actually live. Their inboxes, their porches, their Sunday coffee. Small towns trade in human currency. Reputation. I had been spending mine for 6 years. If I wanted it back, I had to expose what had been paid for. The first ripple came from the diner. By noon, there were packets missing off the counter, and the waitress's face when she told me she'd seen Martin at the counter that morning. He'd picked one up and tossed it in the trash. He wasn't subtle. He was furious in a way that made him look like a man trying to hide a bruise. That told me I was hitting the right places. Then the butcher, who knew people before they knew themselves, appeared at my temporary campsite, my car, the laundromat parking lot, with a half loaf and an incredulous look. "You did more than you said," he said, which was not what I expected. Why would they lie? The question was rhetorical in a town that loved tidy explanations, but the point was made. The narrative had been cracked. The binder at the post office did the real work. Someone took a picture of it, captioned it with a short, furious line, "You should all read this." And within hours, the photo had threaded itself through every neighborhood chat. People read the timeline and saw Martin's fishing license renewal in June next to my mortgage payments for that year. They saw grocery receipts that matched the date of the parents' dinner out and the transfers that covered it. They saw the pattern. My paycheck, their life. A cousin who'd never been close called me to apologize between sobs. A former neighbor left a voicemail saying she'd always suspected something, but didn't have proof. The church secretary, who'd once been a confidant to my mother, left a message on Martin's phone. "Did you know?" Before she had time to filter the betrayal into something more polite. I hadn't wanted to humiliate them publicly. I wanted to stop being invisible. Humiliation is a blunt instrument. The binder was precise. It didn't say horrible things about their characters. It told a story the way receipts do: dates, amounts, facts. In that way, it was brutal without theatrics. A lot of people prefer their morality uncomplicated. Facts make it messy. They tried to clean up. Evelyn called neighbors and friends and insisted the packets were taken out of context, that I'd misread dates, that there'd been verbal agreements, that I was dramatic. Martin took to making rounds, quiet phone calls to people who had once offered him a cup of sugar, asking them if they'd read my wild accusations. The more he defended himself, the more the town's collective eyebrow inched upward. The true peak came at the Saturday farmers market. My mother had been running her errands, probably trying to reclaim whatever dignity could be rearranged into a better story. I walked past the stall where she was standing with a carton of eggs and slid a copy of the timeline into the basket of a woman who'd once been a close friend of theirs. The woman opened it right there, skimmed, and asked without looking up, "Martin, how much of your mortgage did Clara actually pay?" Her voice was casual, her eyes were not. Whatever cordialism their acquaintanceship had relied on, small talk, holiday casseroles, felt suddenly thin. That afternoon, the pastor, who'd been neutral until then, called a meeting. It wasn't a formal inquisition. It was an invitation to talk since something is going around. People came with their packets and their own stories. When I read the timeline aloud, quiet, calm, the way one reads a will, silence fell like a hand coming down on a table. You could hear distinctly the sound of the town reevaluating its scoreboard. Martin's face did what faces do when pride and fear have a fight. Evelyn's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, and for the first time I saw them not as my parents, but as people being read by an audience they had tried to manage for years. A neighbor I'd never spoken to said, "I never would have believed it without seeing it." Someone else muttered, "Why would anyone do this?" As if the idea of a quiet, dutiful life being payment enough was more believable than a ledger. They tried to call it an invasion of privacy. They called me ungrateful. The town, which had been ready to join the chorus against me, split into factions. The ones who'd always loved my parents for their public kindness, and the ones who, now confronted with receipts, couldn't unsee the truth. The revenge, if that's what you wanted to call it, wasn't a scene I staged in front of a crowd. It was a series of small, inevitable reckonings that rearranged the map everyone used to find their moral bearings. I didn't stand on the pulpit. I didn't yell. I photocopied. I mailed. I left binders where people would pick them up on their way to church or the grocery. I let the town see that the story they'd accepted was a polished fiction, and that the facts were in sleeves, tabulated, and unarguable. The only sound I remember clearly after was the soft shuffle of paper as people turned pages, and the way a rumor, once given proof, moves like water finding a new channel. They called it gossip at first, then something heavier, reckoning. For a week the town hummed with packets and murmurs. Women in line at the post office turned pages like they were reading a new scripture. The barber kept one on the counter and shook his head whenever Martin came in for a trim. People I'd barely said hello to stopped me in the street to say quietly that they were sorry. Apologies in small towns are awkward things. They arrive like mismatched Tupperware, useful, unexpected, and not nearly as tidy as you want. Still, they mattered. Martin stopped showing up at the diner. Evelyn kept her head down at church and started taking a different route home. The house stayed the same peeling paint, the same crooked welcome mat, but the bills did not. When the mortgage reminder arrived, it could no longer be dismissed as a hypothetical. The ledger I'd made hadn't just named who paid what. It had shifted responsibility into the light. People began to ask the question that finally mattered. If Clara paid the mortgage, who let this become a chore instead of a partnership? They came around to ask for things. An aunt called to say Martin was ill and needed a ride. A cousin messaged, apologizing, and offering to help with groceries that week. At the grocery store, a woman I'd known since kindergarten asked for my advice about splitting costs with her aging mother. I answered with honesty, not anger, no sermon, just the practicalities of boundaries and bills. I'd expected victory to feel like fireworks. Instead, it felt like a household finally getting its plumbing fixed. No trumpet, just running water. They asked me to come back. Evelyn left a note, thrown like a postcard under my windshield. We were wrong. Come home. The impulse to return, to walk back into the warm, familiar things, my father's terrible coffee, the scuffed chair by the window, was a strange and loud ache. But something in me had shifted. The quiet work I'd been performing had been mistaken for love because I never asked for anything in return. I could not unmake the years I'd given, but I could decide what I would give next. I didn't take the note up. I sent one email instead. Thank you for saying it. I am not the same houseplant who will sit on your windowsill and watch you live. I offered to help in one practical way, pared down, specific, and non-negotiable, so that kindness wouldn't be confused with surrender. They never did call to argue. Pride is a stubborn thing. Apologies often arrive like dangling carrots that never quite reach. The town settled into a new rhythm. People who had pegged themselves as do-gooders found themselves squirming with the realization that kindness without accounting is a kind of blindness. Others, who'd always been quietly careful with their ledgers, nodded at me with a new sort of respect that felt less like praise and more like recognition. Recognition is smaller than triumph, but far more sustaining. I rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, noise that felt alive instead of an audience. I learned to sleep without cataloging who I had made comfortable. I taped one receipt to the inside of the shoebox I kept on the shelf. December 2019, mortgage. A reminder, not of victory, but of the cost of silence. On weekends, I walked the town and greeted people who'd been brave enough to change their minds. When Martin finally shuffled by on an afternoon, cane in hand and face a map of regret, I handed him a sandwich I'd packed, because a person eating is less fraught than a person begging. He took it with 2 hands and mumbled thanks. I said quietly, "You're welcome," and kept walking. The revenge I had imagined was melodramatic, grand, and satisfying like a closing scene. What happened instead was quieter, and in its way, harder. An accounting that asked people to live with the truth of their choices. People repaired what they could. Some apologized properly, some didn't. Some relationships healed, some did not. I stopped measuring my worth in the temperature of a home I kept warm for others and started measuring it in the small but steady things that actually belonged to me. Rent paid on time, a plant I watered when it drooped, a friend who called to see if I wanted to come over for dinner. On a night months later, I stood on my new apartment balcony and watched the little town lights come on. Porches, diner neon, the church steeple's single bulb. The houses looked the same, but their stories had been rearranged. I felt lighter, and for the first time in years, my idea of love included the word no.